Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Hey, foreign policy is really quite an interesting area of study. I think that sometimes people get a little put off when they try to first get introduced to it. You might maybe remember back in school where it was just a bunch of boring dates and maybe pictures of Khrushchev up screaming in the United Nations or something like that. And it kind of, a lot of times teachers taught it in such a way as it was just, okay, I've got to remember these names of people that I've never heard of, what dates something took place, but it's often not put into context. Okay, and that's even true in universities. Hopefully not as true as it is in high school in America, but in universities, it still can be that way. Especially if the professor has a particular political beef or ideological leaning or so forth. Anyway, I'm going to discuss the idea of why actually international relations is quite interesting, especially if we consider it from the viewpoint of Machiavellian thought. Okay? And we'll go into that. First, I'd like to encourage people, if you're watching this or listening to this on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe so you can keep up on future shows and, in case you missed the broadcast. Also, check out my latest sci-fi thriller, and that's called The Destiny of Our Past. You can look that up on Amazon. And if you're into dystopian sci-fi, whereas it's not about Noah, he's kind of mentioned a few times there. Take a look at it. Maybe you can see it as a warning for the future. So anyway, what is a guy that lived hundreds of years ago in what is now modern Italy have to do with foreign policy? Well, everything. And yet most people have never even heard of Machiavelli, unless they're studying to be like diplomats and that sort of thing, or they're really into history. Now, Machiavelli lived in a time period where, and again, I'm not going to make this like a lesson, but I have to give a few details here. He lived in an era where Italy was made up of nation states. They were feuding with each other, a lot of power play. In those days, popes became pope through bribing cardinals to vote for them when a new pope position came open. And hey, it was a pretty good job. I mean, you had, the Vatican was known as being a place where a lot of wild parties took place, depending on your various sexual proclivities and lust for power and monetary gain. It could be a pretty good position. But anyway, these various city-states were fighting each other, and maybe this kind of background makes it so easy to understand why in the past, before that, they were invaded by, for instance, the Muslims and so forth from the Middle East, and plundered and so forth in the early days. And why, for instance, the Vatican City has that big giant wall around it. It wasn't so that you'd have to pay admission to get in. It was protection from its various enemies, both within Christianity and outside of the Christian world. But anyway, Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince. And in The Prince, he outlines this idea that really seems to sum up politics today, especially international relations. It's the idea that power itself is something you need in order to, be able to exercise power. So getting power is very important. Maintaining the power is even more important, especially in his day when, well, losing that power could mean losing your head in the process. But it's not really totally different nowadays if we think about the context of like countries like Libya or Iraq. So the thing is, he's credited with concepts that are often related to the school of pragmatism. It's kind of a utilitarian concept that says, well, you do what you need to do. Okay? And sometimes that gets divorced from what you would call morality. Now, I didn't say Machiavelli was not a moral person, but he actually did say that if you want to be a good leader, sometimes you have to put your morals aside. You may feel that it's wrong to kill someone, but maybe you have to issue an order that that person be assassinated. You may feel it's wrong to blow up a village in a war, but if you're at war, you might have to do it. So a good leader is one that can set aside his moral and religious ethics. Now, this also leads to, and it's paraphrased, but it's still accredited to him, and really it's what he's saying, and that is the ends justify the means. Okay? The idea that if getting from point A to point C requires a certain path that may not be so nice through point B, then you have to do it. Because if you want to get to point C, it may require you to do things that you would not normally do as a good moral individual. Now, of course, this gets related to topics such as psychopathy, where it's part of the dark triad, actually. When people are talking about psychopaths, they will often use terms like Machiavellian thinking. The idea that, hey, I'll do what I have to in order to succeed, to win, to compete, to conquer. And so psychopaths are very much seen that way. But international relations, though, it's supposed to be an area where we put morals above all else, isn't it? You know, I had first class I had on international relations when I was in college. Had a brilliant professor, and you know, you come in there, you're idealistic and so forth, and you believe that, well, the world is run by principle and so forth. And he told the students that there is no morality in international relations. I challenged him. I said, no, wait a minute. No, there is. People try to do good. Countries try to help other countries and so forth. And he said, there's always something behind the scenes, because every country is competing with other countries for resources, for power, for prestige, for influence. And so sometimes maybe giving money to the poor, where, you know, a lot of countries do that, might be ultimately to influence that country to let companies from the country giving the food aid to come in and drill for oil or look for minerals. Well, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm going to go home and I'm going to prove this wrong over the weekend. Problem is, I really researched, I looked, I tried to figure out some holes in his premise, and I couldn't. So ultimately, when you see countries competing for with each other, it is kind of similar to how the mafia operates. You know, where you have various families and they're fighting for turf and so forth. Now, it's to the advantage of an organized crime family not to be at war all the time with all the others. Because if you're always at war, you're going to wind up, you know, killing each other off and never really consolidating power. And the same is true, if we look back in history, we find that various mafias, it just wasn't the Italians. Oh my gosh, it wasn't. You had like the Jewish syndicate, you had the Irish mafia, you had the Italian mafia, but for some reason Hollywood just picked up on this whole Italian thing and made it into, in people's minds. They think, oh, well, the Italians are the organized crime people. I think almost every ethnic group has some sort of organized crime in its country. And sometimes that gets brought over when, people immigrate from one country to another. They will, bring that with them. So when Sicilians came over, they brought connections with them. But anyway, this is not about the mafia. It's about countries competing with each other. And, in some ways, the mafia is nicer. Because when countries compete with each other, they all have militaries, not just for protection, but to also project their influence, so to speak. Bring some of that democracy sometimes when someone's acting up or wanting to change the dollar or something like that as a reserve currency for oil. But the thing is that recently I saw an article where someone was saying, well, wait a minute, it looks like ISIS is being vanquished, that they're being taken care of. They've lost all their major strongholds. Why is the U.S. military not leaving Syria? I mean, it doesn't look like they have any intention of leaving Syria. And, you got to think about it. What's the objective? What's forcing? I mean, people can yell, people can talk about whether it be Russia, which was actually invited into Syria by the Syrian government. It could, or Assad himself, who is, for better or for worse, he is the leader of Syria. They can talk about international law all they want. But really, what is international law? Is there a law that's actually enforced? Who's the policeman? What are you going to do? Arrest the United States for violating international law? International law is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, but ultimately it does not really describe something that is seen in the same way as if your neighbor goes and shoots your dog or something, and then you call the police and he gets arrested. Okay, it doesn't work that way. Now, the only way you can really enforce something is through the exercise of power from various states. Now, I don't see Russia in a position to exercise economic sanctions on the United States. Certainly not Syria. So, who's going to make the United States leave? The United Nations? Guess what? America has a vote in the Security Council. They can veto anything. So, even if someone came up with something saying all foreign countries should leave Syria and Iraq, they can veto it. Okay? So, if you're one of the five big powers, China, United States, Russia, England, and France, you can veto any resolution that requires force in the Security Council. So, America will leave Syria when America determines it wants to leave Syria. Now that sounds, and the same could be true for any other country that occupies territory of another country. The only way you can cause the other country to do something is to, for instance, place sanctions on them to hurt them economically, or to go to war with them. Who wants to go to war with the United States? Who wants to go to war with Russia or China, for that matter? I mean, ultimately, these countries do act in their own self-interest to be able to protect their self-interest and to be able to project themselves more. When it comes to oil, the United States is not going to let anything happen to its oil reserves. And when it works with NATO, which most of the European countries don't actually have oil themselves, well, they of course, are going to be influenced as well. You can see this if you look back in, 1953, when, on behalf, really, of the British government, the United States took out the democratically elected leader of Iran. We can see where that led eventually, huh? Yes, they did have a democratic election. Guy comes to power, he puts some pressure on the British when it comes to prices for Iranian oil. The British really weren't too keen on doing it, so they ask America to help, and America uses its power to overthrow the government. So these kinds of things happen. It happened a lot down in Latin America, Central and Latin America, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The United States exercising power. So ultimately, we have to get back to Machiavellian principles, where pragmatism is the way you look at things. Now, again, I'm going to repeat this, and it's very, very important to emphasize this so that someone can't just go, oh, yeah, but I know a guy. Yeah, you can say that. I know a guy in the State Department, very moral guy, goes to church every Sunday, really cares about people, gives money to the poor, a really good person. So I think he's going to do his best. But you know what? He belongs to an organization. He belongs to an entity. It's like being on board a battleship and not really hurting anyone. The battleship itself has its orders of what to do in the event of a war or any other actions. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I don't want to contribute whatsoever to harming another person. But if you're, working in if you're working on the system, let's make it even easier. You're working as a cook on the ship. Well, you're contributing. You're part of it. Just like the person who's the navigator, just like the person who might be keeping up the radio systems, just like the person who may be keeping up any other number of items. They're part of an organization. So you don't say, well, that's Tommy's ship over there, because it's not really Tommy's ship. The ship is a projection. It's all the people on it working together to fulfill the policy that they're ordered to do from Washington, D.C. And ultimately, the same is true of our government as well. It's made up of a lot of individuals. It's not just, be it Trump or Obama or Bush. There's a lot of people in the background. And there's a lot of factions that have different views. And there's all kinds of interest groups ranging from media to the military-industrial complex. In fact, actually, they merge quite a bit. If you look at their business dealings, our media, we think of the guy with the newspaper and so forth. But it's the big guys on the block that have the most influence, and they're very much corporate. You might wonder, just ask yourself, most people don't ask these questions. Why are the people that ask the president or his spokesman questions in that room? Why isn't your local newspaper in that room? Why isn't probably your state newspaper represented in that room? It is because only the big guys get to be in on the press conferences. And so, most of the media is excluded. They have to rely on what's reported to them, in a sense, secondhand information. They're not the ones to be able to ask the crucial question of the president, for instance. So it's a giant organization. It's a machine that involves hundreds of thousands of people. Yes, there is a leader, the president. He is the symbol of the country. But just like moving the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, there's probably stuff going on in the background we'll never know that is part of that. Doesn't mean it's conspiracy. We just don't know everything that takes place. What did Trump and the Saudis talk about when he was in their country? What did Trump and the Chinese talk about? That's not all open. A lot of that stuff goes on behind closed doors. So we just don't know. But ultimately, as President of the United States, Trump's job is to actually do what's in the interest of the United States. Trump, in essence, ceases to be whoever he is deep down, whoever he is personally. And ultimately, this Machiavellian point of view, or, very related to it, pragmatism, has been part of the American system for hundreds of years. The reason why we may choose to do one thing versus another. And, a lot of times it doesn't make any sense. We think, why in the world are we doing it this way? Why? When in reality, it has to do with resources, it has to do with power, it has to do with forming alliances, it has to do with so many things. And when we're talking about moral principles, those take a back door. Now, like I said, one of the quotes from Machiavelli I thought was interesting. He said he doesn't teach people how to go to heaven, but how to go to hell, but how to avoid winding up in hell. So he felt that ultimately people have to know all the possibilities, all of the repercussions of a policy, all of the variables, and so forth. And sometimes those may not feel like the very best things, to the personal view. But when it comes to wielding power, a person has to consider that if they don't wield power effectively, they can be overthrown. If they're overthrown, that can hurt the population, that can hurt the people. Okay, so ultimately what you wind up with is, a person could go in there with all the best intentions of the world and they screw everything up for the whole country. So it's kind of like these articles I've talked to you about in the past that I've cited and people I've interviewed on psychopathy, where they will say that leaders tend to be high in psychopathic traits. Especially the ones that we really remember, the ones that we really adore, the ones that we admire, tend to be the ones who were the highest in psychopathic traits. Because those were the traits that got them there in the first place, and it's the traits that maintained their power once they were there. Now, again, don't think of someone like Machiavelli as being some sort of evil conspirator, some sort of dark kind of, Game of Thrones sort of guy, or like the guy that was advising the king in Lord of the Rings. I can't remember what his worm, something, I don't know. Anyway, but the thing is, Machiavelli was more of an intellectual. He was just saying, here's the way things operate. But it was up to the leaders to actually put it into practice. And they have. They really have. I would say The Prince is probably one of the most, if not the most important book written on foreign policy. And everyone should actually read it. In fairness, because you'll see that he was a much deeper individual than just some guy saying, go out there and get power and, trounce your enemies and achieve your goals at all costs. Because that's, that's an oversimplification. He did say that if gaining an objective required you to be, nice, that you should be nice. If gaining an objective meant that you had to be ruthless, then you should be ruthless. So the So ultimately, the lesson there is that nothing in international relations should really surprise us. What should surprise us is if we actually start thinking that the United States or Russia or any other number of countries are really, really altruistic and they're just out there to do good for the world. Some sort of Dudley Do-Right. Oh, by the way, he was Canadian, wasn't he? Yeah. Or some sort of superhero. Because they ultimately may want to be as individual human beings, but as governments, they can't afford to be. They can't let their guard down. That's why sometimes in negotiations, a negotiation over a trade bill or a peace treaty, that you think, well, that should be easy to do. We all want peace, so let's just get together and write something up. Well, that doesn't take into account ethnic, religious, history variables. It doesn't take into account resources. It does not take into account the ramifications if certain policies go through. So you see in the Middle East the thing with various countries there where there's problems between this country and that country and whatever. It's really easy to sit back and go, my gosh, why can't they just solve it? I could solve it in 10 minutes. No, you can't. Because if you did get in there in 10 minutes and you just said, we'll do it this way. Well, that's some of the problems that happened in the first place. Like the Sykes-Picot agreement that split the countries up in like Syria and Iraq's borders and stuff like that, where you just had some diplomats getting together and deciding that, this would make a good boundary. But now those boundaries were set in fairness because it benefited France and it benefited Great Britain after World War I. They went into that region and stirred things up against the Ottoman Empire, because they wanted to win against the Ottoman Empire. Then afterwards, they had to maintain the power that they had in the region. And then later, you had things like Israel, wanting to be independent, and so there was lots of fighting there. It goes through a lot of history, but ultimately, the power play that took place, England was always trying to figure out what's best for England. France was always trying to figure out what was best for France. So when countries, you think, well, why can't they just... even Stalin, when Hitler invaded, was willing. He actually was willing to make a deal with the Nazis and say, you know what, if you want this big chunk of Russia, just leave the rest of it alone. And Hitler was too arrogant. He was like, oh yeah, I'm going to crush these Slavs, and and there's no reason for me to make a deal. But Stalin was willing to give up something, not because he was wanting to give a gift to the Nazis. That was certainly not something that, was in his heart. He wanted to preserve his country, and he was willing to give up a chunk of it in order to preserve it. Now, of course, the winter came along, and, the Germans had not dressed for the winter, and they perished. But the thing is that, yes, countries can give up something. Ultimately, I think the United States realizes that Russia's not going to give up Crimea. There's no way that Russia is going to give up Crimea. Now, America can try to maneuver itself in order to get in, better positions with its NATO allies and some of the neutral countries, as being champions of the Crimeans. But America knows that Russia's not going to give back Crimea no matter what you do. But there's no way America can enforce its law on Russia, because Russia has nukes. America has nukes. Neither of those countries want to fight each other. So they'll grandstand and they'll do what they can. Okay, maybe you've got Putin trying to get countries maybe to drop so much reliance on the U.S. dollar. That would certainly hurt the United States. But there too, China's not going to jump in and say, yeah, we'll just dump all of our dollars, because crashing the American economy is not going to be in China's best interest. All right? And America, if it got into a problem with North Korea, is not going to want to take on China, first of all. And, it's not in America's best interest to start really punishing China. So, some of this pragmatism actually does keep things under wraps. So you don't wind up with some leader who is motivated solely by some sort of ideology. There you got someone like Kim Jong. He's the closest thing I can think of, who's motivated by the preservation of an ideology. Although if you look at it ultimately, him and the people around him probably want to preserve their place in power, because it comes with a lot of perks. So their countrymen may be starving, but they do pretty good themselves, and those who are connected to power. So, and ultimately, no one wants to lose their position of affluence and influence within their society, because especially in a place like North Korea, there's not a lot of options for you if you want to retire peacefully. Again, something similar to the way maybe mafias work. But ultimately, I think we can learn a lot by reading Machiavelli, seeing how, governments are kind of like individuals. So, the individual is, the individual persona of the country is what really counts in the scheme of things. And again, every country has, think about America, how many different policies it has to have, how many different connections, business interest, alliances, and so forth. And those have to be continuously maintained, indefinitely, if you want to keep your power indefinitely, and you don't want to slip behind and just become a has-been nation. So read up on Machiavelli and see if you think that really does describe the way that governments work in the international sphere. Anyway, I wanted to deal in this last segment of the show